Hello and welcome to Kentucky History. This is History 240 and we are talking about Chapter 4, Kentucky and the New Nation. All right, let me go ahead and fix these pop-ups. We'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so we are in, this is your newest edition, a new history of Kentucky. Make sure you have the second edition, you really need it. And you should be able to take your full page of notes from this video lecture, and you should also be able to answer the quiz questions properly. So this is mostly for people who are having issues with getting their textbook. No, there's a lot of back order and that sort of thing, and I'm trying to help you out. But also, you don't want to replace this with your textbook reading. You still want to read it, but this explains it better, it breaks it down better. Deconstruct is one of our history words, and this most certainly is deconstructing chapter 4. Okay, we're going to peruse some themes that we need to talk about, and then I'll go a little more in depth into the Kentucky history chapter for this week. So George Nicholas was the writer of the first Kentucky Constitution, and I'm pretty sure he was a friend of James Madison's. We'll probably talk more about that in a little bit. Yeah, he was a James Madison's friend. Also, we're going to talk about pseudonyms, which are like pseudonames, tricky. And why so many people wrote with a pseudonym during this time. And I want to talk about Amygdala Hijack for a minute. So oftentimes in my history classes, I tell you that, one reason why we write the research paper the way we do, just kind of facts, and then we put our opinion at the end in the conclusion, is so that people will read further into your paper before they, have an opinion or a knee-jerk reaction. Okay. And this is something good that you can do in life as well, because there's something called amygdala hijack, where if you're talking to someone about anything, and they're angry or upset, they actually cannot hear you logically speak. They cannot hear you or process anything logically until they calm down. Now, there are certain people in our lives, in our families, that to talk about religion or politics, those two taboos, they're never going to calm down. So the best thing, through psychology or through learned experience or is to just, for me, is to not waste my breath. Okay. Because if somebody can't hear you, why you're wasting, I'm not saying to change their mind. I'm saying, I have good conversations with people who can hear me, but they disagree with me, but we have a good conversation and I hear them and they hear me. And oftentimes I tell my students, growing up, I was taught to win an argument was to change the person's mind. No, that's not how you win an argument. Winning a true argument is to get someone to think more deeply about their side, and for them to get you to think more deeply about your side, and maybe go back to whatever premises you're talking about, and to dig a little deeper and be like, hey, do I know why I believe this? I had a conversation. I'm a huge Bernie Sanders fan. I had a conversation with someone and they were like, well, have you read his books? Do you know really what he believes in? And I do know a lot of his beliefs and his thoughts. And Bernie Sanders has a ton of academic historians, one of my favorite professors from Yale. He has him on his Instagram page and uses academic evidence all the time on his Instagram page. But you know what? Truly, I had not read his books and really understood what he believed in. And so I thought, that's a challenge. This person, they don't like Bernie Sanders, and that's fine. But, I need to dig a little deeper. So I read several of his books, and they were super eye-opening. And I learned a ton and really, question oligarchy in the United States. I know that's such a cliffhanger. You'll have to read it yourself. So moving on. So why did people use these pseudonyms, these pseudonames? You have two people specifically in this chapter, the meddler, And they come to find out that it's probably a woman, and she couldn't vote. Okay, so this was the only way. Her posing as a man, writing in the newspapers, was the only way for her to have her voice and agency. All right, that's sad, but it's the truth. Okay. And then we have another very famous person who used a pseudonym, Henry Clay. He used the name of Scaevola. Okay. And why did they do this? Okay. Why did they do this? Well, there were a lot of people in Kentucky who could not calm down. Okay. Could not calm down, to the point that fights and brawls actually broke out in pubs if you had a differing opinion. And that's too bad, because that's not maturity. Okay. You know, part of maturity is to be able to talk to somebody about politics or whatever. Just having a conversation, explaining, you know, why you think the way you think, and then asking them why they think why they think. Okay. And this is really sad about politics. And George Washington was such just an amazing example to all of us, because he had 3 Federalists and 3 Anti-Federalists on his presidential cabinet. He listened to both sides completely before he ever made a decision. So that would be like having 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, listening to everything they have to say, each side, and then, you know, making a decision. And George Washington, in his farewell speech, and you'll hear me talk about it, we might even read it, he says, this is the best way to destroy our country, because it's us against them. And we will make monsters out of the other side. And he was so right. You know, most European countries have 4 to 6 parties. And it's really a shame that we still have, you know, basically 2, you know. We really need more. Okay. And there's not the infighting and the upheaval, and people listen to each other more in European countries that have 4 to 6 parties. Okay. In fact, in some countries, 2 parties have to work together. So the top 2 parties that are elected have to work together, and that seems to work. And we tried that at the beginning of our country, by the way. It was 2 different parties. I believe that's mentioned in your reading as well. All right, so Henry Clay. I love Henry Clay. You're going to find that out. I just think he's amazing. So you're going to find that out. He really was the most famous and influential Kentucky politician. And he ran for president 3 times. And it's really a shame he didn't get it. A lot of historians really think he should have. Okay, so we talked about the meddler. The first governor of Kentucky was Isaac Shelby. All right. The first 2 senators were John Brown and John Edwards. And then they talk more about a woman named Virginia, or Jenny Wiley. In 1789, there were several groups of Native Americans that came across her. She was pregnant. She had 4 children, and her brother was with her. And she was taken into captivity, and just her, you know, escape and different horrible things that happened in the meantime. So they mention her again, so that's why we are mentioning her again. In 1791, Native Americans got into a horrible scuffle, it was a little mini war, with the Kentucky militia. And the militia was badly beaten. Okay, the Native Americans won. When they went to go retrieve the bodies, they noticed that there was soil stuffed in their mouths. Okay, this is in your chapter reading. And why was that? Why was it? Your book is pretty clear. There was such a lust for land among the Europeans, among the colonists. The Native Americans were extremely aware of it. Okay, just the greed and lust for land was just out of control. It does also talk about the $30 during this land rush time. It was only $30 per 100 acres. Okay. The second governor of Kentucky was James Gerard. We already talked about Henry Clay. Henry Clay wrote under the pseudonym Scaevola because he wanted direct elections, and he was an abolitionist. He was against slavery, and a lot of people around him, rich, wealthy, influential people of power, would have punished him just for having that belief, as crazy as that sounds. Henry Clay did go on to become a Whig of the Whig Party. And I also wanted to mention that during this time there were two parties, and they were the Federalists, which would be the Democrats today, and the Anti-Federalists. So Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson was an Anti-Federalist. But what you have to understand is a lot of different parties have disappeared. Okay, so, I know we're talking, there's lots of different upheavals in parties today, and they change and they morph and they change names and they become something different. The Whig Party was super influential, and it's no longer. Okay, you don't hear about Federalists and Anti-Federalists anymore, but they're very much like the Democrat and Republican parties of today. Very much like it. At the end of the chapter, they're talking about how some lawyers get together and really abuse their law writing privileges, and they end up writing a bunch of laws to protect the wealthiest Kentucky colonists. All right, and that's kind of be a theme. All right, and that's where progressivism kind of comes in. Got to wait about 100 years to say, hey, wait a minute, let's protect everybody. All right, so we're going to dive a little deeper. There were 9 conventions to become a state, and finally got their constitution. There were 2 parties that were really predominant in Kentucky. They were called the Court and the Country Party. There were debates at inns and taverns, and a lot of time there were just all-out brawls and fights. Okay, that is not healthy. That is not mature. That's not how you discuss. I've had some great conversations with people who believe completely different from me, and we have sat at coffee and had a lovely time. So I'll be honest, growing up, I wasn't sure that it was possible. It totally is possible. It's just about love, respect, and not letting that amygdala hijack, getting so angry or taking it so personally, but just remaining calm and being able to just truly use your logical part. And you don't have to change someone else's mind. It's their right to believe what they wish. It is, right? We're in America. So at this time, Kentucky was considered to be pretty radical. Just because, there was just so much fighting and all these pseudonyms. Brawls over politics. Yikes. All right. We talked about the meddler, who was a woman. She was not allowed to vote or even be in a tavern debate. She wasn't even allowed to debate. She didn't have a voice or agency of any kind. So that's why she wrote under the pseudonym of the meddler, and people didn't know till much later. All right. So we talked about George Nicholas, who wrote the Constitution. He was a friend of James Madison's. And it talks about in your book, he cites the Bible to defend slavery. And that's something you really need to look at, because this is really sad, owning a human, all right? People use the Bible to argue against it and to argue for it. Okay. We'll probably talk a lot more about John Rankin. He was a minister in Tennessee, and he spoke out on how slavery was wrong, and he was almost stoned to death in his town in Tennessee. So he moved to Ripley, Ohio. And he was part of the Underground Railroad, helping almost 3,000 people, 3,000 former slaves to freedom. But you couldn't even disagree about slavery in the South. They would be so angry. He was nearly stoned to death, him and his family. So, all right. So Kentucky was having a really hard time because they weren't sure if they wanted to be a slave state or not, and they were having to figure that out. Isaac Shelby is pictured in your book. He's the first governor. There's a picture of him. All right. All right, we talked about the senators already. George Rogers Clark is mentioned again several times, usually with just, wow, he was very cruel to the Native Americans and really didn't have a whole lot of respect for them. Most Kentuckians were from eastern states, so they were, you know, coming from eastern states, coming to Kentucky. All right. We talk about John Breckenridge. Was he the third governor? Not sure. Let me double check I wrote it down here in the back. No, Christopher Greenup was the third governor. But Breckenridge is definitely mentioned a lot in politics in Kentucky. All right. All right, you have another mention of Kentucky and secession. All right. Let's see, they were mad about something. All right. Despite political loss, Breckenridge remained wildly popular because he demanded the opening of the Mississippi River. All right. The lopping from the Union is dreadful to contemplate, even if it should not attach itself to some other power. So they were talking again. Breckenridge and George Washington were really kind of at each other's throats, and Breckenridge was like, you know, maybe we'll secede. All right. So, you know, we never think about that, you know, because we've been, you know, a united for so long, the United States, that it was a real threat several times with Texas and Kentucky, for sure. All right. They do talk about Virginia, Jenny Wiley, and everything that she went through, losing some children. She ended up marrying a Native American, and then she did get away later on. Talks again about the battle between the Native Americans and the Kentucky Militia, where the Native Americans put soil in their mouths. Those who died in battlefield had soil stuffed in their mouths. The Native Americans used the stage of battle to mock the Americans because their land lust. It was like they didn't care who they had to kill, steal, murder, just lust for land. He goes on to talk about the Land Act of 1795 permitted the individuals already claiming land by virtue of having built a cabin and planted corn to purchase 200 acres at $30 per 100 acres. All right. So another wave of land rush. Squatters' rights if you built a cabin on a certain thing of land. All right. Okay, so pre-state era, this is really a little sliver where the door for women's agency opens up just for a teeny bit of time. But on page 82, it does talk about before Kentucky became a state, they allowed women to divorce for just a little while. And we know that that doesn't happen later on. We've talked about femme coverture, where you're covered by your husband once you're married. So therefore, anything that you inherited, you know, from your dad, or if you worked and got money, you had to give it to your husband. None of it was yours. You were owned by your husband. Okay, you were property of his. So there was just a little brief time where that happened, and then of course it went back to the patriarchy where women's rights were kind of erased, very much erased. All right. Henry Clay was an apprentice to Nicholas and Breckenridge, and he had very different ideologies than those two, and that's why he wrote under a pseudonym. So we talk about slave codes, and remember, slave codes are prior to the Civil War, okay? So much of that was you couldn't teach your slave to read or write. You could not, a slave could not be a witness against a white person. They could not sue if something had been done wrong to them. They can't buy or sell with each other. They have to have passes by owner to go anywhere. They couldn't have guns, knives, and no marriage. Remember, one of their biggest rebellions against being a slave was to create a family, which I think is absolutely beautiful. But the sad part was they were not recognized. The marriages were not recognized. In fact, some slave owners were just, oh my gosh, just so evil. They would not let them, you know, have partners, marriages, families. They would put them in, you know, barns. And if you've ever seen 12 Years a Slave, wow, it's like the best depiction of anything I've ever read in history. But they put them in barns. They wouldn't even let them have sex, okay? Which is, you know, I mean, it's kind of a human thing, for sure. And so sometimes they would be beaten for being caught, or just no relationships were allowed, okay? It's really awful and inhumane. All right. The marriage and slave codes of 1798 were just part of a larger process through which state government defined white men's rights and strengthened patriarchy. All right. And the first thing that slaves did when they were emancipated was get married and find the rest of their family. All right. Okay, so in 1798, you do have this, I think I mentioned it before, you have President John Adams was voted in, and he was a Federalist. And Vice President was Thomas Jefferson, and he was an anti-Federalist. So you have these two opposing parties ruling together. But they changed it later on so that it was the same party, okay? Alien and Sedition Acts, kind of crazy. Okay, the Alien and Sedition Acts, not being allowed to voice your opinion about anything in the government if you didn't agree, which is like, that's not, you got to be at least be able to say, hey, I disagree. But that was not a choice. Okay, a lot of prison reform needed to happen because so many people, you know, people were getting death sentences for stealing fish, okay? So they were trying to have some prison reform so that only for murder you got the death penalty. Because honestly, you got the death penalty for everything. And especially you're going to kind of see that especially once slaves are freed, a lot of times penalties for free African Americans was death, but not for whites, okay? And that happened for over 100 years. Voice voting, all right. Okay, white men were voting to keep white men citizens and not allowing anyone else to be a citizen, all right, because they wanted to keep that power. And then we talked about at the very end of the chapter that wealthy men were protecting themselves and not other people, all right. And then the governors of Kentucky are mentioned as well. Okay, so I think we got into chapter 4 pretty well. Hopefully you have enough for your notes, and you definitely have the answers to the quiz if you were listening. So good luck and have a great night. Thank you.